Okay, let's get into this. We talk a lot about narratives,
Oh.
how they're built, how they get sold to people, and how they shape the world we actually live in.
Mm-hmm.
And usually when we look at something that gets labeled a conspiracy theory, you expect to find, blurry photos of UFOs or these like super convoluted charts about the Illuminati.
Sure.
But today, we are looking at a source that takes one of the most radioactive topics in American life,
Yeah.
the Great Replacement Theory. And it tries to just strip away that conspiracy label completely.
It's a heavy one today for sure. We're
Mhm.
looking at a broadcast from Tucker Carlson dated January 2026. And the argument he's making isn't really about secret meetings in some dark room.
Right.
He's arguing that this whole theory is actually just, well, arithmetic.
Yeah. He frames it as math and history.
Hmm.
And it's not just him in a monologue. This is a pretty layered presentation with on-the-ground reporting from Minneapolis with a freelance journalist,
Big
Nicole.
sorter. And a theological breakdown with the pastor, Joe Rigney.
Exactly.
And we really need to be crystal clear about our mission here. This is a deep dive into the argument itself. We are deconstructing how this specific source links census data, violent street riots, and theology into one singular worldview.
And we aren't here to endorse the rhetoric or the politics.
Not at all. We're here to understand the signal that's being broadcast.
So let's just jump straight into the deep end. The source opens with a pretty direct challenge to how you, the listener, see reality. Carlson says, essentially, if you ask AI or Google about the Great Replacement, they will tell you it's a debunked Nazi myth.
Which, to be fair, is true. That is the standard categorization for it.
But then he pivots. He says, forget Google. Look at the census. He's tried to get around the listener's emotional defense mechanisms by rooting this opening argument in, what he calls the science.
It's a very clever rhetorical device. I mean, by leading with hard numbers, he attempts to sanitize the controversy around it. The source builds its entire foundation on a comparison between what he calls peak America, which he defines as the year 1950 and the present day 2026. He just walks through a list of major U.S. cities to show a total demographic inversion.
And the numbers are just staggering when you hear them rattled off like that. I mean, he doesn't just say things have changed. He paints a picture of a completely different country.
He really does. He highlights New York City, which was 90% white in 1950. Today, the source pegs that number at around 30%.
Wow.
He looks at Detroit, 84% white, down to 10%. Baltimore, 76%, down to 27%.
The one that really got me was Los Angeles. In 1950, LA was 94% white.
94.
Today, 37%. That is a massive, massive shift in a single lifetime.
And that's the hook. The source argues that no nation in history has gone through that level of demographic change without a war or a total collapse.
And a standard sociologist might look at this and talk about, white flight, the rise of suburbia, organic economic shifts, that kind of thing.
Of course.
Yeah.
But the source completely rejects that. He argues this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a natural drift.
He calls it a swap.
Precisely. He points to the Immigration Act of 1965 as the smoking gun. The argument is that the leadership class, specifically, he says, the political left, looked at the country and decided they just didn't like the people who lived there, so they decided to import new ones.
He calls demographics the realest thing there is. But what's the motive? I mean, why would a government want to replace its own population?
The source sort of toggles between two motives here. The first is the old cheap labor argument, that corporations just want someone to pick grapes for $5 an hour.
But he dismisses that, doesn't he?
He does, actually. He says, in the age of AI and automation, you don't need millions of low-skill laborers.
Which implies the motive has to be political. And this is where they bring in that Stacey Abrams clip from, 2018?
Yes. This is a crucial piece of evidence for their case. In the clip, Abrams is listing off the Blue Wave Coalition, the groups that are going to help Democrats win. She lists African Americans, Latinos, the LGBTQ community, and then she explicitly includes the undocumented.
And that's the aha moment for the source. They point to that and say, see, they admit it.
The argument becomes that the left views demographics as destiny. If you can't convince the historic population to vote for you, well, you just import a new population that's dependent on the state and you secure a permanent ruling majority.
And the source connects this directly to voting laws. He points out that, 14 states plus D.C. have no voter ID requirements at all.
Exactly. So the argument is you import the people, you refuse to check IDs, and you've effectively canceled out the vote of the native-born citizen.
But the argument goes darker than just winning elections. If it were only about votes, that would be, cold political calculus. But The source says there is a psychological component to this, something he calls racial triumphalism.
This is where the transcript really moves from numbers to intent. The source argues that the current leadership actually hates the historic population.
And he uses that really strange anecdote about Nancy Pelosi to prove this point. It was about her grandson, right?
I did catch that. It's a very specific, very odd story to include unless you understand what the source is doing with it. Pelosi was on the House floor, and she's recounting how her 6-year-old grandson said, "I wish I had brown skin and brown eyes like my friend Antonio."
And Pelosi framed it as this beautiful, heartwarming moment of inclusivity. The beauty is in the mix, she said.
But the source just flips the script on that completely. Carlson asks, since when is it a good thing for a child to wish they were something they aren't?
Right.
He argues that if the child had said, "I wish I wasn't gay," Pelosi would have been horrified. But because he wished he wasn't white, it was celebrated.
He frames it as an expression of self-hatred that is being socially engineered, and then he just widens the lens to history. He says, former majorities are never treated well.
This is the absolute core warning of the entire broadcast. The source argues that when a group loses power, the new majority doesn't just say, "Okay, we're all equal now."
Yep.
They say, "Now it's our turn to crush you."
He brings up the history of Ireland, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about the British moving Protestants into Catholic Ireland to, displace the culture. He mentions the Mongols under Genghis Khan using violence to alter the genetics of conquered populations. He even points to modern examples like Zimbabwe and South Africa.
The phrase he uses is crush and humiliate.
Right. Racial triumphalism. The idea that the conqueror builds their monuments on top of yours. He points to removing Confederate statues or renaming buildings not as progress, but as a signal of conquest.
We run this now. Down with your heroes, up with ours.
Oh, precisely.
So if that's the theory, that the population is being swapped and the new order wants to humiliate the old one, how does that actually manifest on the street? Because the source then transitions from this high-level history straight to the freezing streets of Minneapolis in January 2026.
And the picture they paint is just absolute chaos. This is where we hear from Nick Sorter. He's a freelance journalist who's apparently been documenting riots for years, and he describes an incident with an FBI vehicle that is just wild.
I had to rewind this part. So rioters find an FBI truck just parked on the street.
Yeah.
And they don't just smash a window. Sorter says they hooked a tow strap to a pickup truck and ripped the weapons locker open.
Yeah, like opening a can of sardines. And they didn't steal a laptop or a radio. Sorter claims they stole a select fire automatic rifle.
So we're not talking about a handgun here, a select fire rifle.
Yeah.
That is military hardware.
Yes.
The source is claiming there's a literal machine gun loose in Minneapolis because a tow strap popped a lock.
And here is the kicker. Sorter claims this looting went on for 2 hours. 2 hours. He says the FBI agents and the Minneapolis police were nearby. He went to them, gave them the description, the license plate, video footage.
And they did nothing.
Nothing.
Well, I mean, is it incompetence? Is it cowardice?
The source argues it's systemic. Sorter calls the leadership cucked and feminized. He throws specific insults at Mayor Jacob Frey, calling him Mayor Soy Boy and Governor Tim Walz.
Mm-hmm.
But the implication is that the police have been ordered to stand down, that the state has decided not to protect its own property, let alone the citizens.
And speaking of citizens, Sorter tells this story about his own encounter with the police. That is, well, it changes the whole social contract of calling 911.
It really does. He claims he was robbed and dragged by a vehicle by what he identifies as a Somali gang. He calls 911. And the dispatcher's first question wasn't, "Are you hurt?" or "Where are you?"
It was, are you white, Hispanic, black, or Somali?
Just think about the implications of that for a second. The source is arguing that emergency response is now engaging in a kind of racial triage. Depending on your answer, help might not come.
That connects back to the source's theory about the Trotsky-style revolution. I think a lot of listeners might miss that reference. What is he actually getting at there?
Well, he's referring to Leon Trotsky's concept of permanent revolution. It's the idea that you keep society in a state of constant agitation and chaos. You destroy the stability of the old order so that a small vanguard can seize power.
And so Carlson is arguing that leaders like Frey and Walz want the violence.
Exactly. The chaos isn't a failure of policy.
It is the policy.
That's the argument. They are using the mob to consolidate power. And Sorter adds another layer. He claims the riots are a convenient distraction to cover up massive fraud scandals involving the Somali community in Minnesota.
So you get this mix of high-level revolutionary theory and just low-level grift.
It paints Minneapolis not as a functioning American city, but as a conflict zone where the state has lost its monopoly on violence. Sorter describes Border Patrol agents being hunted, boxed in by 20 or 30 cars at a gas station, having to use tear gas just to escape a parking lot.
It's an apocalyptic vision. You have the demographic replacement, you have the breakdown of law.
And that leads us to the final layer of the argument. The source moves from the street to the sanctuary.
This is the segment with Pastor Joe Rigney. And honestly, this is where the entire argument shifts from being political to being spiritual. They talk about an incident at City's Church in St. Paul.
The scene they describe is just jarring. You have a church service in progress. The sermon is literally on the topic, love one another.
And suddenly activists burst in.
Right. The source plays the audio. It's intense. You hear a woman just screaming at a parishioner named Renee Good. She's yelling about her lattes and jewelry while immigrants are suffering. She's calling the people in the pews sinners and fake Christians.
This is a direct clash of worldviews. But the source adds this really interesting detail about the media. They allege that the former CNN anchor Don Lemon was embedded with these protesters.
Embedded, like a war correspondent.
That's the framing. The source argues that Lemon and the media see this disruption not as harassment, but as a righteous act against white supremacy. To them, the mere existence of a peaceful, white Christian space is an act of aggression that needs to be dismantled.
But Pastor Rigney, his reaction is really interesting. He doesn't get angry in a political sense. He goes biblical.
Yeah, he reframes the entire conflict. He says, Jesus was the target. He isn't looking at this as a protest. He sees it as a spiritual attack. He draws a parallel to the book of Acts and the stoning of Stephen.
And for those who are a little rusty on their Sunday school, Stephen was the first Christian martyr, right?
Correct. Stephen was stoned to death by a mob because he wouldn't stop preaching. Rigney argues that the American left is climbing an escalation ladder. First they mocked Christians, then they questioned them. Now they are moving to physical confrontation.
He even cites the assassination of Charlie Kirk the previous fall as an American Stephen moment.
That is a massive claim. He's framing political figures as religious martyrs.
And by doing that, he removes any possibility of compromise. I mean, you can negotiate with a political opponent. You can't negotiate with evil. Rigney explicitly states that the government has inverted its divine role. Romans 13 says the government exists to punish evil and reward good. Rigney says the current regime rewards lawlessness and punishes the law-abiding.
Which leads to his final ultimatum. He says there are only two options left for the nation.
Christ or chaos.
That's the binary.
And this brings the whole deep dive full circle. Remember that demographic argument from the beginning?
Yeah.
The source claims that without a unifying religious force, specifically Christianity tribalism, is the default setting of humanity.
Tribalism is the default setting. That is a haunting thought.
It really challenges the modern secular idea that people are, naturally good and cooperative. The source argues that in a state of nature or in a diverse society without a shared God, people will inevitably divide into ethnic tribes and just devour one another. Carlson says it's a masochistic dynamic always, and someone is on the wrong end of it.
And the implication is crystal clear. The historic population of the U.S. is currently being positioned to be on the wrong end of that violence.
Right. So when you step back and look at the architecture of this whole broadcast, it's a very cohesive narrative. It starts with the math of replacement, the census data. It explains the strategy with Stacey Abrams and voter laws. It shows the result in the lawlessness of Minneapolis.
And it offers the solution, or the only perceived refuge, which is a return to a kind of hardline Christianity. It constructs a worldview where the social contract is already dead. The government is the enemy, the police are compromised, and the only thing left is to retreat into your tribe or your church.
It's a warning. The source is telling the listener, the world you knew is gone. The new majority will not be benevolent. Prepare accordingly.
It raises a massive, uncomfortable question for all of us to chew on, I think. If the source's premise is true, that tribalism is the hardwired default of human beings, what does that imply for the future of a modern democracy?
Can a multi-ethnic secular democracy actually survive? Or is it just a brief historical anomaly that inevitably collapses back into ethnic conflict?
That is the question this deep dive leaves you with today. It's Christ, or it's chaos. And whether you buy the premise or not, understanding that this is how a significant portion of the population sees the world is essential.
It always is. You have to understand the argument.
If you want to check the data points, the census numbers, that Stacey Abrams clip, or the full Rigney interview, we've linked the original source material in the show notes. Go look for yourself.
Verify everything.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.